North America was home to a great variety of people, so it's difficult to generalize, but here's what we can say. One, when the Europeans arrived, there were no classical-style civilizations with monumental architecture and empires like the Aztec or the Incas. And two, native North Americans had no metalwork, no gunpowder, no wheels, no written languages, and no domesticated animals. However, they did have farming, complex social and political structures, and widespread trade networks.
Mr. Green, Mr. Green! So they were pretty backwards, huh? Well, I mean, or at least primitive.
Primitive is a funny word, me, from the past, because it implies a romanticization. These simple people who never used more than they needed and had no use for guns, and it also implies an infantilization. It's like you believe that just because you have a beeper and they didn't, they were somehow less evolved humans. But you can't see the human story as one that goes from primitive to civilized. That's not just Eurocentric, that's contemporary-centric. The idea that we're moving forward as a species implies a linear progression that just does not reflect the reality of life on this planet. I get that you like to imagine yourself as the result of millennia of advancement and the very pinnacle of humanness, but from where I'm sitting, that worldview is a lot more backwards than living without the wheel. So no one knows exactly how many people lived in North America before the Europeans got here. Some estimates are as high as 75 million, but in the present US borders, the guesses are between 2 and 10 million. And like other Native Americans, their populations were decimated by diseases such as smallpox and influenza. Actually, it was much worse than decimation. As many of you have pointed out, decimation means 1 in 10. This was much worse than that. It was closer maybe to 8 in 10, which would be an octocimation. So there had been civilizations in North America, but they peaked before the Europeans arrived. The Zuni and Hopi civilization, round about here, peaked about 1200 CE. They had large multiple family dwellings in canyons, which they probably left because of drought. Crash Course World History fans will remember that environmental degradation often causes the decline of civilizations. I'm looking at you, Indus Valley, and also you, entire future Earth. But complex civilizations weren't the rule in North America, and now we're about to begin generalizing. A bad habit historians have, partly because there's a limited historical record, but also because Eurocentric historians have a bad habit of primitivizing and simplifying others. So I want to underscore that there was huge diversity in the pre-Columbus American experience, and that talking about someone who lived here in 1000 BCE and talking about someone who lived here 2,000 years later is just inherently problematic. That said, let's go to the thought bubble. Most native groups in most places organized as tribes, and their lives were dominated by the natural resources available where they lived. So West Coast Indians primarily lived by fishing, gathering, and hunting sea mammals. Great Plains Indians were often buffalo hunters. These tribal bands often united into loose confederacies or leagues, the best known of which was probably the Iroquois Confederacy, also called the Great League of Peace. This was kind of like an upstate New York version of NATO, but without nuclear weapons or the incessant international meddling or Latvians. Okay, it was nothing like NATO, actually. Religion usually involved a vibrant spiritual world with ceremonies geared toward the tribe's lifestyle. Hunting tribes focused on animals, agricultural tribes on good harvests, and most Indian groups believed in a single creator god who stood above all the other deities, but they weren't monotheistic in the way that Christians who came to the New World were. American Indians also saw property very differently from Europeans. To First Peoples, land was a common resource that village leaders could assign families to use, but not to own, and most land was seen as common to everyone. As Black Hawk, a leader of the Sauk tribe, said, "The Great Spirit gave it to his children to live upon and cultivate as far as necessary for their subsistence. And so long as they occupy and cultivate it, they have a right to the soil." Thanks, Thought Bubble. So many of us tend to romanticize American Indians as being immune from greed and class, but in fact there were class distinctions in Indian tribes. Rulers tended to come from the same families, for instance. That said, wealth was much more evenly distributed than it was in Europe. And while most tribal leaders were men, many tribes were matrilineal, meaning that children became members of their mother's family. Also, women were often important religious leaders. Women also often owned dwellings and tools, although not land, because again, that idea did not exist. Also, in many tribes, women engaging in premarital scoodly pooping wasn't taboo. In general, they were just much less obsessed with female chastity than Europeans were. I mean, I will remind you, the first English settlement in America was called Virginia. The idea that Native Americans were noble savages, somehow purer than Europeans and untouched by their vices, is not a new one. Like some of the earliest Europeans saw the Indians as paragons of physical beauty and innocent of Europeans' worst characteristics. But for most Europeans, there was little noble about what they saw as pure Indian savagery.